In the quiet candlelit chambers of late 15th century Europe, when stone palaces still held the chill of medieval winters and physicians whispered in Latin over bowls of smoking infusions, a new and troubling illness began to move silently across the continent. It was in the year 1494 that the armies of King Charles VIII of France marched into Italy. Soldiers from France, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, and distant lands gathered beneath Neapolitan skies. War, as it often did, became a meeting place of nations and of unseen afflictions. Not long after the campaign, chroniclers began to describe a strange and feared disease. It seemed to appear first as a minor affliction, a sore, almost unnoticed, yet in time the illness progressed, touching the skin, the bones, even the mind. The physician Girolamo Fracastoro of Verona would, in the 16th century, give it a name in a poem written in 1530, Syphilis, Siv, Morbus Gallicus. In his verse, a shepherd named Syphilis offends the sun god Apollo and is punished with the disease that would carry his name. But long before poetry softened its image, the illness had already reshaped the course of history. In France, it was called the Neapolitan disease. In Italy and the German states, it was known as the French disease. In Russia, it became the Polish disease. Each nation quietly placing blame beyond its own borders. The pattern was as human as it was ancient, fear searching for an external cause. By the early 16th century, syphilis had established itself in royal courts and in crowded port cities alike. It moved along trade routes, with sailors crossing the Atlantic, with mercenaries returning from campaigns, with diplomats and merchants who connected the fractured princedoms of Europe. Some scholars would later debate its true origin. One theory, known as the Columbian hypothesis, suggests that the disease was carried from the Americas to Europe by the crew of Christopher Columbus after his voyage of 1492. Skeletal remains in the New World show signs of treponema disease long before European contact. Yet others argue for a pre-Columbian presence in Europe, perhaps misdiagnosed or poorly documented in medieval texts. The truth remains, even now, gently veiled by time. What is certain is that syphilis changed. The strain described in the late 15th century was said to be unusually severe. Contemporary accounts speak of rapid deterioration and widespread suffering. Over the centuries, the disease appeared to grow less immediately aggressive, evolving alongside the human hosts it inhabited. In the royal courts of Europe, reputations were fragile currency. Health was not merely personal, it was political. Marriages were negotiated across borders to secure alliances. Heirs were expected to be strong, legitimate, and capable, a silent disease that could pass from parent to child, that could linger unseen for years before emerging in debilitating form, held the power to unsettle dynasties. King Henry VIII of England has long been the subject of speculation. Born in the year 1491, he ascended the throne in 1509. Over time, his health declined, ulcers, mood swings, leg pain, and reported changes in temperament. For centuries, some historians have wondered whether syphilis might explain part of his behavior and his difficulty in producing surviving male heirs. Yet modern scholarship finds little conclusive evidence. Medical records from his reign mention treatments for other conditions, but not the mercury cure commonly used for syphilis. The question remains open, more reflection of the disease's shadow than firm proof. Elsewhere, in the vast territories of the Holy Roman Empire, syphilis moved through aristocratic bloodlines and artistic circles alike. The painter Albrecht Dürer, living in the early 16th century, believed he had contracted the illness during his travels. In 1521, he wrote of fevers and strange symptoms. Whether it was truly syphilis is still debated, yet the fear of the diagnosis was enough to shape perceptions. Treatment in those early centuries was as perilous as the disease itself. Mercury, administered as an ointment, a vapor, or ingested, became the standard remedy. The saying arose, "A night with Venus, a lifetime with Mercury." Patients were placed in sweating chambers, their bodies covered in toxic salves. Some survived the cure, others did not. The boundary between medicine and poison was thin. And so, as the 16th century unfolded into the 17th, syphilis remained a constant, quiet presence. It touched the powerful and the poor, the devout and the rebellious. It moved without fanfare, without banners, yet with consequences that would echo through politics, art, and the very fabric of European society. In the dim corridors of palaces, decisions of war and peace were sometimes made by rulers whose health was uncertain, whose judgment may have been clouded by pain, by treatment, or by the hidden progress of disease. And in that fragile space between private suffering and public power, history itself was gently but persistently reshaped. As the 17th century gave way to the 18th, Europe entered an age of reason, of scientific curiosity, of salons filled with philosophers and experiments. Yet syphilis did not retreat before the light of the Enlightenment. It remained patient, adaptable, interwoven with the private lives of those who shaped the modern world. In the year 1746, a child was born in France who would later be known as Charles Maurice de Talleyrand-Périgord. Though not directly linked to syphilis, he lived in a society where the disease was common among aristocratic circles. Diplomacy, romance, and political intrigue often moved in the same drawing rooms. Health in such an environment was rarely discussed openly, yet it influenced alliances, marriages, and successions in subtle ways. By the late 18th century, physicians had begun to observe the distinct stages of the disease. First, the initial lesion, then a period of seeming recovery, and later, sometimes many years later, neurological or cardiovascular decline. The idea that an illness could lie dormant, almost invisible, only to return with greater force, unsettled even the most rational minds. Napoleon Bonaparte, born in the year 1769, rose to power during a time when syphilis was deeply embedded in European society. While there is no solid evidence that Napoleon himself suffered from the disease, many of his officers and contemporaries did. Military campaigns, as in the 15th century, remained conduits for transmission. Armies carried not only cannons and ideals, but microbes. In the 19th century, syphilis became both a medical and a moral concern. Urbanization brought dense populations together in rapidly expanding cities like London and Paris. Public health debates intensified. Some governments introduced regulations aimed at controlling prostitution, believing it to be a primary source of infection. These measures, however, often placed the burden of blame on women while ignoring the broader social dynamics of poverty and inequality. Medical science advanced slowly. In the year 1838, the French physician Philippe Ricoeur clarified the distinction between syphilis and other venereal diseases. His work brought greater diagnostic precision. Later, in the year 1905, the bacteriologist Fritz Schaudinn identified the causative organism Treponema pallidum. For the first time, the enemy had a visible form under the microscope. Treatment evolved as well. In the year 1909, the German scientist Paul Ehrlich developed salvarsan, sometimes called compound 606. It was one of the first chemotherapeutic agents directed against a specific pathogen. Though not without side effects, it marked a turning point, the beginning of targeted antimicrobial therapy. Yet even before effective treatment, syphilis had already left its imprint on art and culture. The composer Ludwig van Beethoven, born in 1770, suffered from numerous ailments. Some early biographers speculated about syphilis, though modern research suggests other causes for his decline. The painter Edouard Manet, born in 1832, is more credibly believed to have endured the disease in its later stages. His final years were marked by frailty, yet his artistic vision remained luminous. Perhaps most famously, the writer Oscar Wilde, born in 1854, lived in a society where syphilis was both widespread and cloaked in silence. Though there is no conclusive proof that he suffered from it, rumors followed many figures of his era. The disease became a metaphor in literature, a symbol of hidden decay beneath polished surfaces. Then, in the year 1943, penicillin emerged as a decisive cure. What had haunted kings and commoners for more than 4 centuries could now be treated effectively and safely. The discovery transformed public health. Rates of advanced syphilis declined sharply in many countries. The shadow that had lingered over dynasties, over armies, over ateliers and academies began to recede. And yet, the story does not end simply with a cure. Syphilis reminds us how deeply disease and history are entwined. It shaped marriage alliances, it influenced succession crises, it altered reputations, it inspired poetry and stigma in equal measure. It exposed the limits of early medicine and propelled scientific innovation. In the quiet archives of Europe, in letters written by trembling hands, in medical ledgers, in the margins of diplomatic correspondence, traces of the disease remain. Not always named, not always confirmed, but present, like a faint watermark beneath the grand narratives of conquest and revolution. As night settles gently over the centuries, we are left with a subtle understanding. Power is never entirely separate from vulnerability. Even kings, surrounded by velvet and gold, were not immune to the silent workings of nature, and history itself, so often told through battles and treaties, is also a story of bodies, of frailty, of resilience. In that awareness, there is a certain calm, a reminder that behind every throne stood a human being, and within every human story, there moves an unseen current, shaping destinies in ways both fragile and profound.